Hi, folks. Thank you so much for being here on this lovely, what is it, Thursday evening, taking time out of your schedule from the park to be here. And we're both very appreciative of that. I'm going to try and cram in a lot of evolutionary history in about 20 to 25 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Jeff and I just recently finished a course. What was it, like less than 48 hours ago? We were teaching this course actually out at the Lamar Buffalo Ranch. Now, that was a 5-day course, and we're going to try and cram a lot of the messaging and information of that 5 days into a mere hour. So hold on, hold on to the side of your seats. We're just going to get going here. So yeah, we'll be discussing essentially life in the Pleistocene, and that's where we're going. But before I go there, I just a bit of background about me, just to give you a sense of why I might be teaching a course on dire wolves, mammoths, and life in the Pleistocene. I spent the last 40 years or so at working as an evolutionary ecologist, a field scientist, a conservation biologist, working with some really spectacular species, all of which are highly endangered mammal species on different continents around the world. Mostly, I've been working with species within the order primates, also elephants, and more recently, carnivores, especially canids, including wolves, and in various sites around the American West. But the reason why I bring this up is because I want to emphasize the evolutionary ecologist aspect of the way that I think about the world. I'm interested in the origins of things. And I have indeed spent quite a bit of time engaged in paleontology in different parts of the world. But I'll just say right off the bat that I have not excavated a dire wolf. I have excavated a woolly mammoth on Wrangel Island, north of Siberia, which was pretty fantastic. But this is sort of a big picture kind of talk in which I'm going to give you enough information about the Pleistocene, about an epoch that was up and running until about 10 to 11,000 years ago. And then I'll hand it off to Jeff, who will complete the story about how humans made a living in this landscape over 10,000 years ago. So our goal this evening is to bring the Yellowstone of 10,000 plus years ago to life for you all, right? Because as much as this is an absolutely fantastic system with arguably one of the most complete assemblages of species anywhere in North America, perhaps in the Northern Hemisphere, absolutely in the United States, it is nothing relative to what it was, say, 10, 11, 12,000 plus years ago. And that's what we want to kind of bring to life for you. So what I'm going to be doing is describing kind of life in the Pleistocene through the lens of the fauna that were here, or the wildlife species that were here, and discuss these wildlife species in the Pleistocene, paying particular attention to some salient species. And what I mean by that is cognitively salient to us all, right? And not meaning we've all recently, especially been hearing about dire wolves, we all have a feel for what a woolly mammoth might be. Well, these were two species that would have been very important in the world of hominins or humans that were living here in the Pleistocene. So that's where I'm going to be going. And again, I'll be handing it off to Jeff after that. So this is, of course, an artist's reconstruction of life in the Pleistocene in these parts, where all of the species are crammed into one single landscape. There was an immense fauna, right? That, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But before I do that, I first want to define what I mean by Pleistocene. So just as we have a taxonomy or a naming species or a naming sort of system for living species, we also have a naming system for time, right? And we can thank Charles Lyell here, a British geologist in the 19th century, for coming up with a lot of the words that we're using today, including the Pleistocene. So the Pleistocene is an epoch, right, that is within the Cenozoic era. Right, we are currently living in the Holocene. Some might argue that we're living even in a more recent epoch than that, called the Anthropocene, where we are going to be discussing, or what we're going to be discussing today, is the Pleistocene, a unit of time that spanned 2.58 million years up to about 11,700 years. Colloquially, this is referenced as the Ice Age. And again, we all have a sense of what the Ice Age is, and we would like to kind of expound on that in various ways throughout the next hour. But before we get there, just to give you a sense of what is meant by the Ice Age, essentially, this is a period of time in which there were repeated glacial and interglacial cycles. Right, so this was a time on Earth, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, that was extremely cold, sometimes colder than others, in which case more of the world's water was held up in massive glaciers that then ultimately retreated, but then came back again. And especially, this was a phenomenon that was taking place throughout the Northern Hemisphere. The last so-called LGM, or the last glacial maxima, really is that time in Pleistocene history that witnessed the most expansive extent of glaciers. And those glaciers started retreating at about 20 to 18,000 years ago. And just to illustrate, for those of you who have not spent time around glaciers in very, very high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere today, during various times of the Pleistocene, the global sea level was roughly 400 feet lower than what it is today. And that was because of the atmospheric and climatic conditions, and that water then was held up in massive sheets of ice that were literally hundreds of feet in height. These glaciers covered 8% of the Earth's surface, 25% of which comprised terrestrial systems, right? So these glaciers were upwards of, in some areas, upwards of 2 miles thick, such that the weight caused the Earth's crust to sink in certain areas. And I'm mentioning these statistics just to give you a sense of how, even up until recently, this area would have been vastly different than what it is today. The average global temperature about 11 degrees colder than what it is today. The Pinedale Glacier is the glacier that when you guys are out and about in Yellowstone Park and you see these expansive valleys, this is an image from the so-called Little America region, which is right to the west of the Lamar Valley. You can see these so-called glacial erratics. These are rocks, granitic rocks that have been left behind by moving glaciers. And what you're looking at here is the expanse of the so-called Pinedale Glacier, which was the glacier that was present in these parts before it fully melted away. So another aspect of what happens when a lot of the world's water is held up in ice is that sort of regions of continental plates become exposed. And this region in particular, this so-called Beringia region, or a land bridge, has been exceptionally important in the evolutionary and biogeographic history of the Northern Hemisphere. So this was a land bridge that connected the Eurasian continent with the North American continent, and was exceptionally important in what we would call sort of faunal exchange, right? Movement of animal species from Eurasia into North America and vice versa. And there was a lot of movement over the period of time that this Bering Land Bridge was in place, including movement of human populations, and Jeff will talk more about that later on. And so this bridge was a connection that was episodically open until about 13,000 years ago, and as I mentioned, was of exceptional importance to the peopling of this continent. So what you're looking at here is my attempt at summing up the origin and dispersion history of our own species, Homo sapien. We're a baby species. We've only been around for about 300,000 years. That's what's being depicted here by this marker at basically in sub-Saharan Africa. We evolved in sub-Saharan Africa, and what you're looking at in these red arrows is the movement of our species out of the continent throughout the Eurasian, or out of the African continent into the Eurasian continent, ultimately peopling the Eurasian continent in various areas between about 30 and 70,000 years ago. Now, there were hominin species, more primitive hominin species that had left Africa previous to our species leaving Africa. Homo erectus, for example, origin also in sub-Saharan Africa, had left the continent by about 1.8 to 2 million years ago. Other more primitive hominin species also were on the Eurasian continent when our young, anatomically modern Homo sapiens species arrived on that continent. And certainly at several times in evolutionary history of our lineage, there have been multiple species occupying the same landscape, which is a whole other story unto itself, but of most notably Neanderthals, right? So, which they would have encountered most dramatically in regions of Western Europe. But having made their way to Eurasia, movement of modern humans across the Eurasian continent, pushing east, ultimately crossing the Bering Land Bridge, and then moving down into North America between about 18 to 20 plus thousand years ago. The more that we study the genomics and the evolutionary history and get in and sort of perfect dating methods, the older those dates become, right? At one point, it was radical to make any statements that human beings had been on this continent longer than maybe 11 or 12,000 years ago. We now know that there is a much deeper and longer history. So this is the movement of our species throughout the Northern Hemisphere. I want to shift to the wildlife of the Pleistocene, which was dramatic, right? So mammals have been diversifying really since the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction that separates the Mesozoic from the Cenozoic, right? And of course, that's the time of catastrophic asteroid impact somewhere in the Yucatan of Mexico that transformed planet Earth. This is the end of the age of reptiles and the beginning of the age of mammals. And during the, throughout the Pleistocene epoch, there was extensive faunal exchange back and forth. Wildlife species during the Pleistocene epoch was vastly higher than it was today. I'm going to talk a little bit about that with regards to the predators, the species within the order Carnivora. But generally speaking, throughout the Pleistocene, there were more orders of mammals and there were more families of mammals and more species per taxon, so more species per genus. So there were more species and they were big, right? And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Just to give you a sense of the species that were around up until about 10 or 11,000 years ago, our grizzlies today are very are very large-bodied, although they look petite next to skeletons and skulls of the giant, of the short-faced bear. There were multiple bison species in different parts of the northern hemisphere over the Pleistocene, giant beaver, Castoroides species. Horses, the family Equidae, evolved in North America. There were a huge diversity of equid species throughout the Pleistocene. There was a giant pika, multiple giant ground sloths, multiple felid species. Of course, saber-toothed cats get a lot of attention, but there were many others, scimitar cats, an American lion, American cheetah, and several pronghorn species. Some of you may have heard the story. This was written up many years ago by John Byers, who worked with pronghorn, of why are pronghorns so very, very fast, right? And the argument there that has been made is because up until fairly recently, they had a very, very fast predator that was pursuing them. And of course, American cheetah are no longer around, but we see the vestiges of that Pleistocene past. I want to emphasize, I mentioned that I was going to emphasize a couple of sort of groups of salient species, hence the name of this talk, which is direwolves and mammoths, hence the name of the class Jeff and I just finished teaching. And I want to mention the proboscoideans, right, the elephants that were here and in the Northern Hemisphere in general, but including North America and including a discussion here of mammoth. There were many of them. It's hard to wrap our heads around the idea of, multiple elephant species moving around North America, but they were here, including the American mastodon, which is actually pretty distantly related to our modern elephants today. Woolly mammoth are more closely related. Mammoth, the closest living relative of mammoth is the Asian elephant, not African, but I'll get there later on. Mastodons, the Columbian mammoth, and then a group of what are called kind of primitive proboscoideans, known as the gomphotheres. That's what's being depicted there. And this is just showing a flourishing of different proboscoidean species. Actually, elephants, that entire group, evolved in Africa, made their way up into Eurasia, crossed over that land bridge, and then settled here in North America as well. Just a few words on mammoth. These were the so-called cold adapted elephants of the northern tundra. Right, so there are discussions, and we can get into that in a little bit, about bringing back woolly mammoth. Right, they were around up until, I have that on the next slide, they were around up until about 3,700 years ago in kind of refuge populations in different parts of the northern hemisphere. But most of them were gone by about 11,000 years ago. They were an extremely important food resource to multiple predator species, including our own. They had this thick, shaggy coat, massive amounts of subcutaneous fat to keep them warm, and they were adapted to life in a very cold tundra grassland type system. And they lived within and amongst humans, right? Both in Eurasia and in North America. They are depicted frequently in Upper Paleolithic art, as you can see here. Jeff will talk more about this and has indeed some of the tools that would have been used to bring down mammoth. But they were mostly gone by about 10 to 11,000 years ago, although, again, a few remnant populations upwards of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. The predators, wow, were they fantastic. I just wish I could have seen some of these amazing species running around, because again, as epic as the predator assemblage, the so-called carnivoran guild here is, right, it was nothing compared to what it was. right, during the Pleistocene. And on average, compared to modern carnivorous communities, right, there were many more species, and then there were many more individuals per species, so more abundant overall. On average, about 47% larger in body mass, and per community or per assemblage of carnivorous predators, there were more of them that were large, right? So larger than about 100 kilograms. What I'm showing here is, in this slide and the next, are a couple of graphics from a really nice piece by Blair van Valkenburg and colleagues, published in 2015, comparing and contrasting the carnivorous predators now versus in the Pleistocene. And so what you're looking at here in blue are the total number of carnivorous predators that were larger than 21 kilograms in Yellowstone National Park. So we've got a North American, an Asian, and an African assemblage, and you can see here total number of species in the blue for today's predators relative to the upper or late Pleistocene, right? And here we've got, it's just lumped old world versus new world, and you can see that there were many more species per community, right, of large-bodied predators. Another graphic from Van Valkenburg et al. Showing estimated body mass, right, of these predators in the Pleistocene, as depicted in red here, relative to the blue, which is extant or living communities. And again, you can see there are species from Africa here, Asia, and North America, and these are both Old World and New World species from the Pleistocene, and you can just see in the red just how much larger they were. A few words about dire wolves. Dire wolves, they were up until recently lumped into the genus Canis. That's been all reworked now. It's clear, in fact, that dire wolves, their closest living relative is not gray wolves, but in fact the dhole, D-H-O-L-E, of especially abundant in the subcontinent of Africa. But then it was repositioned into a separate genus. But dire wolves, I had to bring it up. Gosh, they're so salient for so many reasons. You know, it was funny, I always mention this. For years when I would teach, evolutionary biology, I'd talk about dire wolves, and my undergrads would just roll over them. And then one year I mentioned dire wolves, and like all the students were like, yeah, dire wolves are so cool. And it was because of Game of Thrones, right? That was when they first started hitting like some kind of sociocultural, tipping point of awareness. They are by no means this large. We can talk about this later on, but it would be just, without mentioning the extreme attention that they have recently received. And again, we can talk about that. They have become exceedingly salient and received a lot of attention because of their, not only Game of Thrones, but because of some work that has recently been announced by Colossal Biosciences, and again, we'll talk more about it. But dire wolves, they first appeared about 250,000 years ago, about 250,000 years ago. They were extinct by about 9,000 years ago. They are not just of North America. There are specimens down from South America. If any of you have been to the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, you know that dire wolves are the species that are taken out of the pits more than any other species. They were extremely abundant there, and that is indeed where we get most of our information from. And in fact, the ancient DNA that was used in the work by Colossal recently was taken from fossils out of the tar pits. So this is a depiction before it became understood that perhaps their pelage or their fur color was lighter than we previously understood. What this artist reconstruction is showing is a competitive agonistic interaction between gray wolves and dire wolves over a bison kill there. So they are more robust. They were not bigger than gray wolves in terms of being lankier or longer or what have you. They were more robust, meaning their bones and their teeth were sort of just suited more for doing some very serious bone crunching, similar to like maybe if you think about what hyena do. So they were adapted apparently for a scavenging. Yes, they would have been good predators, but also scavenging niche space. Evidence of pack behavior, probably cooperative hunters, similar to what we see in wolves. And what you're looking at here are just indicators of some of their robusticity. Again, not necessarily taller or longer, but just sort of more kind of sort of robust aspects of their cranial and postcranial anatomy. So the question is, what happened, right? Why aren't these species all around? And the reality is that extinction is part of our history, right? We have had a number, at least 5 previous mass extinction events. The most recent one is the one I mentioned at 65 million years ago. We are living through what has been called the 6th mass extinction now, the biodiversity extinction crisis. And arguably, this 6th extinction started in the Pleistocene, right? So these are images, artist reconstructions of us as an apex predator, right? We are adapted big game hunters. This has been part of our niche space for a long time. Apex predators, species not eaten by any other species in a system. And in fact, because we are the only species that kills other apex predators, we are sometimes called super predators, hyper predators, hyper-keystone predators, because we as a single species are, account for the mass extirpation of apex predators around the globe. And we've been doing this for a very long time, not just our species, but even the direct previous species, Homo erectus, adaptations, and that's the species you're seeing here, adapted for bringing down large prey, including apex predators. And it's, our impact on animal populations has been particularly impactful on large-bodied mammals in general, and that's what this is showing, not just now, but then. And in fact, this idea of humans hunting and being really, really good at it, as Jeff will soon be telling you, has been a major discussion in what the heck happened to all of those large body Pleistocene mammals and birds as well. These megafaunal extinctions occurred basically on every continent that humans showed up to in our movement around the globe. Right. And by megafauna, I'm referencing any species larger than about 100 pounds or 44-ish kilograms. Average time to extinction, waves of extinction after the arrival of humans to an area where they had not previously been is about 1,500 years. About 50,000 years ago, 150 genera were gone. By 10,000 years ago, 97 more genera were just gone, right? Anywhere, and these were waves of extinction events, anywhere humans showed up. This remains a huge discussion. Most folks are, agree that the data support this human hunting or overkill, blitzkrieg kind of effect of humans because we're such efficient hunters. Others have suggested climate change, disease. It's an ongoing discussion. Too much for this. But regardless of what the cause was and how much human hunting played a role, which on balance, it looks like it was human hunting, we are left today in places like Yellowstone Park, not with that whole array, that whole panoply of large-bodied predators, but just a handful, right? As spectacular as it was. So the upshot of life in a cold, upshot of life for humans in a cold and very harsh landscape with megafauna and abundant predator assemblages is that it was extremely difficult, right? As Jeff talks about, we are pansies compared to what we were just a mere 10,000 years ago. It was not only really cold, but Pleistocene peoples dealt with the potential threat of predation on a 24-hour basis. And fear would have been this kind of constant presence, this constant reality. But, right, we cannot be scared all the time, right? We have a fight or flight system, right, that does put us into fight or flight at the you know, the presence of something that is potentially harmful, but we cannot live in a constant state of fight or flight. This is extremely energetically costly. The limbic system, the amygdala, that whole fight or flight kind of array hijacks the frontal lobe's ability to reason. So humans in the Pleistocene, how they coped, how they coexisted with all these other apex predators, many large-bodied mammals, would have been just habituation to knowing that there were other predators and large-bodied mammals around, knowledge of what the heck to do about it, right? Knowledge of where predators might be or might not be, a diverse toolkit, including dogs, such that what it would have meant is that optimal behavior in so-called landscapes of fear would have been this balance of Pleistocene foragers and hunters in these parts and everywhere would have been sensitization to that threat, but also being habituated, or really of knowing when to be afraid and when knowing when you don't need to be afraid, right? And this is exactly what you're seeing here. This is a highly conserved set of behavioral responses, right? These ungulates know that that lion is not about to kill them. They are not constantly in a state of fight or flight. And this would have been the case for folks making a living here. They would have known, they would have had extremely rich knowledge about how to hunt, where to avoid predators, etc. And all of this is lost now, and we're trying very much. This is one of the many reasons why we now have to, have workshops and teach folks, like what we're doing in Western Colorado, of how to make a living in areas now where there are a new apex predator around, gray wolves. So Jeff will now be taking over in the next part of this as he discusses what those tools were, how humans made a living in these landscapes with megafauna, avoiding getting eaten and ensuring that they had enough to eat themselves. So,
yay!
Yay!
Well done.
That's a lot in a half hour. Sorry that went longer.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. Some tourists should actually learn the flight mechanism, right, of grizzly bears and whatnot.
They need to activate their limbic.
Yeah, exactly. There's the other mode of ignorance, right? Most tourists are good, though. Most tourists are good. Many of them are. Many of them are. So up front, I have an assemblage of different stone tools, and we'll save that for after. I'm not going to pass them around during. We won't have time, but you're welcome to come up, look at them, ask questions, play around with them. Most of them are replicas, some of them aren't. You'll hear me scream if you drop the ones that aren't. But most of them are, so don't worry about it. So Lisa Diekman loves it. She always says, don't talk about computers. Show the picture of you peeing your pants. So that's what I did. My name is Jeff Reed, and that's me over 50 years ago with my family in Yellowstone, having just peed my pants while watching Yellowstone's wildlife for the first time that I could remember. It was a very humbling start to a lifelong love of this very wild place where I grew up. I got a loose connection here. Let me do this. Are we back?
Came and went.
There. Don't touch it. So thankfully, I eventually learned to hold it in and went on to study anthropology and did a PhD in computational linguistics and ancient languages like these. And later in my tech career, I turned my attention to animal communication, working with some of the Yellowstone Wolf Project team here, especially led by Dan Staler, who showed up. And their work's going to be featured in a TED Talk on June 2nd. Do not miss it, like it, spread the word, and give them the recognition that they deserve. So I still remember how blown away I was by this stat when I studied anthropology back in the 80s. Of the 80 billion people who have lived on Earth, 90% have lived as hunter-gatherer traders, 6% as agriculturalists, and the remaining 4% as industrial societies. So I'm going to take you through a whirlwind tour of what these hunter-gatherer traders were up to here in the Yellowstone area. And like I mentioned, afterwards, come up and look at some of these tools. If you like this stuff, if you dig it, buy this book by Doug McDonald. I think it's here in the bookstore. Doug's a genius at University of Montana, and this book is epic. And also visit the Heritage Center just down the street here and support Yellowstone National Park's archaeology team led by Beth Horton. Now, more than 1,800 archaeological sites have been documented in Yellowstone National Park, with the majority dating to the Archaic period, which we'll come to. People seem to increase their use of the Yellowstone area beginning about 3,000 years ago, and during this time they began to use the bow and arrow, which replaced the atlatl or spear thrower that had been used for thousands of years. Today there are 27 amazing tribes who have ancestral and modern connections to the park, but long before teepees and bows and arrows, the oldest people we know that experienced Yellowstone lived here about 13,000 years ago when dire wolves and mammoth and all sorts of other critters that Joanna talked about roamed the land. They were called Clovis, and this was one of their signatures. I will pass this around. This wasn't used probably to kill mammoth. This was more ceremonial. And their signature was this flute, this piece of stone they would take off on the base, which is very hard, and many swear words were given when they failed. So I'll pass this around. It's a replica. This, I think, is now the second largest ever found in North America out of Wenatchee, Washington. So feel free to pass it around and look at that flute. That's the signature flute of the Clovis people. Now this map shows locations where their tools have been found. They were a prehistoric Paleo-American culture best known for those fluted projectiles that they used to hunt large Ice Age mammals like mammoths and mastodons. It's named for a place, a site near Clovis, New Mexico, and their stone tools represent some of the earliest widespread human technology in the Americas. Now, Joanna kind of mentioned it. They once were thought to be the first inhabitants of the continent, and new evidence suggests that there were humans here earlier. Still heavily debated, but especially by some archaeologists in Wyoming. I'm not in Wyoming, and I'm a Montanan. Now still, the Clovis culture remains a key marker in understanding early human migration, adaptation, and their interactions with those megafauna that Joanna talked about in the Pleistocene. Ask yourself this: How did this technology spread all the way across North America in 300 years and then disappear? So people got here by first crossing the land bridge in Beringia that Joanna showed you, and then most likely went down the Alaskan and Canadian coast here, and then later started to go down an ice-free corridor that ended roughly in Montana, not far from what is now referred to as the Anzac site. Now in 1968, a year after my birth, one of the most important archaeological discoveries in North America was found about 60 miles north of here. It's the oldest burial in the Americas at roughly 13,000 years ago, and it was a 2-year-old boy. Jennifer Raff, who's a geneticist who has pieced together the lineage of North American peoples based on genetics from the Anzac boy, puts it best. Quote, "Like all their children, the 2-year-old boy was treasured by his people. To honor him, they buried him underneath a rock shelter with great care and love, sprinkling his body with red ochre. Everyone in the community contributed to the toolkit that he would take with him into the afterlife. Some placed carefully flaked finished tools, projectile points, knives, and scrapers for hides. Others left the cores that he would need to make new tools while there. 2,000 years later, when another boy was suddenly taken from his family, they derived some comfort by burying him close to their ancient ancestor for protection." And this is a photo of some of the tools that were found at that burial site. The child was obviously loved by his family. Now, very recently, archaeologist Scott Dursum, a Montana boy, is challenging what we thought we knew about Clovis history. The artifacts pictured here were found at roughly 10,000 feet in the Beartooths, an elevation long believed to have been buried beneath ice 13,000 years ago when the Clovis were around. Kathy Whitlock, a renowned professor at MSU, her work shows that lower elevations were already ice-free and vegetated by then. Scott's evidence now suggests even the high country was at least seasonally open and occupied. And if it's confirmed, this would be the highest elevation Clovis site ever discovered. Now, what were they doing? Were they summering here, hunting megafauna, mammoths, bighorn sheep, grizzlies, the short-faced bear, maybe even large bison like Antiquus or Occidentalis? And if so, did they have to fight off predators like dire wolves to protect their kill sites? Here I am holding that massive biface, shaking, which you can't see, which was buried beneath only a few inches of sod at that 10,000 feet elevation site. But this site wasn't just about hunting. Those stone tools tell one story, but we're starting to see is a glimpse of the Clovis culture. For example, that crystal, and I think you took that photo, I'm contemplating, was found deliberately placed, multiple of them, around a cache of stone tools. Was it spiritual? A marker, a star map? My theory. We may never fully know, but it's clear they were doing more than just surviving here. Now this map shows the Anzac site near Livingston in the top left, north of Livingston. And the high alpine Clovis sites are over there on the far right. And you see that yellow line? They're both connected by an ancient glacial valley. And long before Europeans arrived, bison would migrate through this corridor, wintering near the spring-filled, you can see the irrigation there, landscape near Livingston. And then they would go to the summer grasses of Lamar Valley and the high country beyond it. And it's likely that the Clovis people followed these migrations, entering and leaving Yellowstone with the changing seasons. Park County, Montana, and the northern range of Yellowstone holds one of the most extraordinary wildlife corridors on Earth. And those early humans knew it. Nope, that's where we are, sorry. Give you perspective. Now, stone technology goes back about 3 million years, one of the longest running tech success stories. Sorry, Silicon Valley, right? 3 million years. Early humans didn't just chip rocks, though. They started hurling sticks, throwing sticks at birds, and eventually spears like this 300,000-year-old one used by Homo heidelbergensis. And I call this the iPod technology zone. Some of you don't even know what an iPod is. Now, this is the kind of stone tool most of us think of, and I saw this along Hell Roaring Creek. But this graphic reveals the whole story. After Clovis arrived, up there in the top left, stone tools exploded in diversity, diverse shapes, sizes, and functions. And look at the center here. Someone last week suggested that these people also discovered mushrooms and peyote. You young kids will have to ask your parents about that one. Long ago, am I going to get in trouble for that one? You can edit that out. Long ago, just like we slap cases on our iPhones, someone had the genius idea to combine the stick and the stone, like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich of prehistory. Over the next 2 million years, things evolved sharper, sleeker, more specialized, and archaeologists can track these different cultures through time based on what the tool looked like. In the same way, the iPhone has shifted slightly over time. So I call it the IROC, is when spears were being used to thrown at, and we find arthritis in lots of remains of people from throwing these things their entire life. Maybe the IROC 7 is the atlatl, a way to throw a spear faster and farther. And maybe the IROC 15 were bows and arrows, which didn't show up here till about 2,000 or less years ago. Now think about it. For 11,000 years in Yellowstone, people were throwing an atlatl to kill animals, not using a bow and arrow. And you can come up and see this atlatl later. This is the base, which I made out of a bison rib. Most of them probably were wood. And this is how you threw it, right? And they're long. Okay? And so you can practice with this later. Don't kill anybody. So for 11,000 years, those were used, and they were about 9 to 10 feet tall. That's really long. Now, up in the top right, you'll see some buddies and I looking at a 10,300-year-old atlatl foreshaft found in the Beartooth. 10,300 years old that Craig Lee's team found. Now, in the bottom left, you're looking at the basically where the stone would be hafted into that foreshaft. This would be, which is broken, which would be attached to another one twice as long, and then on top of that would be a stone tool. And right there, you see them? Those 3 hash marks? We don't know what there were. Were they identity symbols, a kill count, a way of marking ownership or memory? Like I said, we don't know. But the story was carved in wood a long time before paper was ever created. And atlatls were so essential to ancient life that people often decorated them like putting a flashy case on your iPhone, right? This one from around 15,000 years ago in France has an ibex that you can see the head is turned looking back, and there's the full implement. And the dart would be put on there. And so it gives you a sense that even then, beauty and function often went hand in hand. Now, I mentioned that archaeologists often determine how old a stone is by its shape. And here are some common ones that are in Doug's book. So Clovis down here, moving through time up to more recent times here. And what do you notice about the size through time? They're getting smaller. Now, why might they have gotten smaller? The prey could be smaller. That's definitely one idea that's going on. But definitely they're getting smaller, and also the diversity of prey you were taking. So those are the tools, but what was the source material? These are different types of source material, and I have some of them up here. Different colors of obsidian. It's not all black, right? Cashman dacite, my favorite. Chert, all sorts of colors of chert, and orthorquartzite, and chalcedony. All of these things would be turned into these. And finding those quarries was very important. And you would keep that history and knowledge within your group. Now, archaeologists can also sometimes figure out what people were eating by analyzing the organic material left on the tool, like blood or protein. And here's just a few of them that have been found in this area. Excuse me. Rabbit, rodents, bear, cat, deer, bison, all from left behind on the tools themselves. Now, how did you throw an atlatl? Now, I'm not going to throw it in here, so I'm just going to show you a brief video of me throwing one. And I'm not that great. I ain't no Clovis. And you can see I missed. And then I'm talking about the next age in technology. And this is a sheephorn bow. You should come up and feel it. I'm describing it. It's made from 2 bighorn sheep curls. You heat them up, you unroll them, you take the edge off, and you create this base. Then you splice them together, and then it's patience personified. You lay sinew down. This would be pushed back like this, so the back would be here. It's less than a pound. It's extremely light and extremely efficient. And you'll see me shoot it. They're hard to shoot. They don't have sights, right? We ain't no Clovis anymore. And you kind of have to get good at where that arrow is going to come off the bow when you shoot it. And then last but not least, my friend George Buman and I, he made 10 microblades about this long of obsidian, not beautiful knives, just microblades. We wrapped some leather around it, and we skinned and deboned an entire elk with 15 blades, just to give us a sense of what it was like. And it took a while. So I'm a wannabe Clovis, and modern hunting doesn't even compare to what they face. Joe showed you this picture. Now imagine stumbling upon one of these giant beavers, this is up in Canada somewhere, when you first arrived. Now Colossal brought back the dire wolf. I want them to bring back the giant beaver. Look at the teeth. Look at the size of that thing. It's crazy. Bring back the giant beaver. Colossal. Now let's shift. And I want to thank Dan and the team, especially the Cougar Project team, for sharing this video with you guys here today. And I want to talk about what First Peoples might have learned from other animals on how to hunt. And this video is a harsh reminder of nature's reality. An elk leaps about 80 feet to its death, driven by wolves who use the cliff to their advantage. Ready? That's the elk landing. And no, there's not someone there videoing this. It's just a camera trap. The wolves came down a side path and ate the remains. Now, early people may have picked up hunting strategies just by observing predators like this. We know Native Americans later used similar tactics, and the Old World also used drive lines. Native Americans used cliffs to drive bison off of, and maybe they learned it from wolves, whether here in the New World or in the Old World. And of course, they didn't hunt alone. They likely used their own wolves, domesticated into dogs, as hunting partners. And as you can see, the circle of life, everything gets a piece. This fox was chased off by a wolf, but later came back and got a nice juicy rib. And watch this. Look at how fell the belly is now. I think this is a submissive wolf, and we've got experts in the room. Now watch this tail. He'll look back as the next wolf comes in. Boom. And watch this tail. But they're both full, right? Just finished at Wendy's, and you know, they're fine. And all life gets a piece of this death. Golden eagle, magpie, and this coyote, highly attentive. Talk about fight or flight. It's got a little chunk. You'll see a raven fly in. And imagine how many times you might have witnessed this as a human and then started incorporating that into your reasoning and hunting strategies. And then I love this ending. Yep, taking that home to the family. So as I mentioned, in the Old West, the bison would have been free to roam outside the park. And as they returned from Lamar down into Paradise Valley in late July for the rut, they ran into a pinch point near Immigrant, right here. And if I zoom in on that, Here's my house. All of these white lines are drive lines, and I've walked almost all of them, that early peoples used to, just like predators used the landscape as choke points to funnel bison through, and other animals, like pronghorn or bighorn sheep, using atlatls and bows at the end of those drive lines to kill them. And here's a video, a drone footage of one of those ancient structures in Paradise Valley, taken by Casey Anderson, my friend. You can see the rock. See how big that thing is? And this goes way off into the distance. It is insane what these people did. And this would have been in a period of more communal hunting. And it's a remnant of how the hunters used the shapes of movements, used the shape of the landscape to move wildlife across them. Now, these people weren't just hunters and gatherers, they were traders, and one of the most prized things that was traded from Yellowstone is obsidian. It's a natural occurring volcanic glass formed when lava cools really quickly with minimal crystal growth. It's highly valued by all sorts of cultures. It was used for tools and weapons and trade due to its razor sharp sharpness when napped with a hammerstone or a billet, which you can see over there. Now, these are photos from Obsidian Cliff, which you haven't seen. You have to stop and see, and you know you can't take anything from it. Leave it for others to enjoy. But it is the most gorgeous piece of rock possibly in the world, and people drive right by it. This is where it was traded, all across America, even as far east as the Ohio River, where it was used a lot by the Hopewell people. So life wasn't all just about hunting, right, and gathering. People needed shelter, and this is a wickiup, a temporary dwelling used by the Mountain Shoshone later. In 1880, just 8 years after Yellowstone became a national park, its second superintendent, Norris, reported that wickiups were still abundant in nearly all of the sheltered glens and valleys. Now, we don't know what Clovis lived in, but this type of temporary shelter, seasonal shelter, may have been one style, especially when they were up high for short periods of time. And of course, these shelters had hearths, places where families gathered to cook, share stories, and stay warm. This one is eroding on the banks of the Yellowstone River, not far from here. And it's about 5,000 years old. And it's a very quiet but powerful reminder of the lives that once lived in this landscape. They made clothing using awls and drills, which I have some of up there. And they used cordage, and I borrowed this from Craig Lee because I don't have good photos of him. His team found this cordage, which erodes quickly, right, decays quickly, and it was found at one of the last ice patches still remaining in the Beartooths, which are now melting rapidly with warming climate. Now, cordage had countless uses, including nets, large nets to capture bighorn sheep. Can you imagine that? Making it from twisted plant fibers. And I have a slingshot up here, which you can not try with a stone, but you can play with, made by my friend George Buman, all from twisted cordage, all from a plant that he made. And of course, there are baskets like this one, crafted 1,500 years ago from willow, using milkweed fiber for the stitching. I could go on forever, but I have to stop. And that was just a brief glimpse into the lives of the first people who walked this land at the end of the Pleistocene. And I want to end with the words of Osborne Russell, who spent multiple years in the Greater Yellowstone in the 1830s as a fur trapper. Here's another book you can contribute to Yellowstone Forever by buying in the bookstore. This is his journal, written later in his life. After he traveled through the Yellowstone area and around this area, he became a politician in Oregon, of all things, and eventually left public life disillusioned by its constraints. Now, when he penned his memoir later in life, he didn't write about legislation or lawmaking. Instead, in the introduction to his journal, he wrote of a place he longed for when he was younger. Quote, "My heart warmed at the recollection of scenes long past. The very air I breathed in those regions seemed more pure, more inspiring than elsewhere." And in one account within the book, he describes the moment he first rode into Lamar Valley, what we now, some of us call the Serengeti of America. Nearly a century after he was there, it would become the last refuge for wild bison, barely saved from extinction by the federal government and the likes of Roosevelt and Grinnell. And when Russell rode his horse into Lamar Valley, he encountered a people living a very simple life. And here's what he said. "Here we found a few Snake Indians, and these were likely Tukadika or Mountain Shoshone, comprising 6 men, 7 women, and 8 or 10 children, who were the only inhabitants of this lonely and secluded spot. They were all neatly clothed and dressed deer and sheepskins of the best quality and seemed to be perfectly contented and happy. Their personal property consisted of a small stone pot, probably soapstone, and about 30 dogs on which they carried their skins, clothing, etc. on their hunting excursions. They were well armed with bows and arrows pointed with obsidian. The bows were beautifully wrought from sheep, buffalo, and elk horns, secured with deer and elk sinew and ornamented with porcupine quills, and generally about 3 feet long." Now, like I mentioned, you can get his book in the bookstore, which is closed, but come back tomorrow. And this is a quote from the beginning of what? Who knows what this is from?
Lord of the Rings.
Very good. Rocco, I was counting on you. It's the Fellowship of the Ring, but we'll count that. Now, I suspect that Osborne would agree that many of us today have lost our ancestors' knowledge of wild places and the intelligence of animals and plants around us. Not so the Tukadika, or the people who came before them all the way back to the Clovis. The Tukadika were described by fur hunters in the West as complete masters of what is called the Kabbalistic language of birds and beasts, and can imitate to the utmost perfection the singing of birds, the howling of wolves, and the neighing of horses, by which means they can approach by day and night all passers-by. This is a map of all the roads in the lower 48 today. And here we are, one of the last mostly roadless places. This is a very special place. Take it in. For those of you who are going to be out there this week, cherish it, protect it, fight for it, and perhaps use it to inspire your conservation efforts back where you live, and take inspiration from the Clovis and other people who were here. So thank you for being. I almost made it on time, sorry. And if you've got to leave, feel free. If you have questions, ask them now. She's the smarter one in the room, so I'll direct them to her. Thank you.